call this to order. It's 6:36. Sorry for the delay. The plan for this evening is Attorney John Whitten is going to give us the 40B for dummies recital. John has tremendous experience in this area. He's an attorney. He has land use training. He's written extensively on town land use and development. He's written extensively on Massachusetts development. It's specifically related to 40B. He's works for the KP law firm, and it's we couldn't have anybody better to inform us on this. The plan would be John is going to talk in general terms about the whole 40B process, so that everybody here, we're going to learn about the process. There won't be any specific comments about the proposed development in town, because John isn't actually familiar with that. After that, Angus will give us a little bit of a summary of the timeline of what's going on. And after that, we'll leave it open for questions for not an indefinite amount of time, maybe I'd say half an hour, 45 minutes, and have callers limited to try to limit their questions to 2 minutes. So without further ado, John Whitten, thank you so much for helping us out.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the board and members of the public, and Angus. I haven't seen Angus in a long time, but we go way back, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I have a PowerPoint show that Angus is going to run for me, and Angus, I'll just say next slide. When it's time, if you don't mind. And Mr. Chairman, members of the Board of Selectmen or Board of Appeals, feel free to interrupt me as we go through this, just because it's a lot easier to respond to your questions during the discussion than toward the end, but I leave that up to you. But I certainly welcome your interruptions. So Angus, maybe if we start with the first slide. And go to the next slide. So the history of 40B dates way back to 1969. Literally, not one word of the statute has changed since then. It's an old statute. It's a controversial statute, and it's the law. I have a position on the statute compared to how other states develop affordable housing, but frankly, none of that's really relevant because the legislature has not sought fit to revise the statutory scheme since 1969 when it was first adopted. So the goal tonight is to talk about how the law works, how it interfaces with a series of regulations that come after the law. The statute is first, and then agencies develop regulations to implement the law second. So we're going to talk about both, and we'll talk about it from 1,000 miles high. But again, feel free to interrupt me with specific questions that you have as we go through the material. So you have heard that 40B is one-stop shopping. That's kind of true, but not really, and we'll talk about why that's not completely true. We know that 40B projects almost always have a density far greater than underlying zoning. That's in part what makes it controversial. And we know more recently that many 40B projects have sought to include some non-residential component within the 40B development itself. So 40B is the statutory code. It's chapter 40B, sections 20 through 23. And the heading of that section is called regional planning. So the legislature in 1969 at least gave some nod to the sense that we were looking regionally for the development of affordable housing, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. So Angus, next slide, please. So the statute 40B sections 20 through 23, it's worth reading. I sent to Angus for the Board of Appeals and the Board of Selectmen and for the public as well, both the statute and the regs. It's only 4.5, 5 pages long, so it's not a voluminous statute at all. But the regulations, which are found at 760 CMR 56, the regulations are extraordinarily detailed, and they seek to implement the statute. But there are many instances where the regulations conflict with the statute. And we know as a matter of constitutional law that regulations cannot conflict with the statute. The statute is supreme and regulations are secondary. There is a fair bit of litigation going on in other cities and towns across the Commonwealth challenging that inconsistency. And I'll talk a little bit about it tonight, but the most important part for tonight is the inconsistency between the statute and the regulations as it relates to the so-called safe harbor provisions. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Next slide, please. The Board of Appeals needs to adopt local comprehensive permit rules and regulations. Now, that word needs to is pursuant to the regulations themselves and the statute. But there is an opportunity for boards of appeals when they adopt local rules and regulations to really try to level the playing field somewhat. The statute is decidedly working against cities and towns that have not met the so-called safe harbor requirements. We're going to talk about that in a minute. One way to try to level the playing field is through the adoption of local rules and regulations. There are a lot of really good examples out there in the Commonwealth. Some are pretty aggressive, some are less so. Because of West Newbury's limited infrastructure, West Newbury is in a more vulnerable position than a lot of cities and towns. So, for example, the ZBA's local rules could take that into account, where there's on-site wastewater and on-site water supply. The point for now, though, is the importance of local rules and regulations because they give the Board of Appeals an opportunity to dictate at the beginning what the board wants for comprehensive permit applications. Because they cannot be independently challenged, a developer seeking a comprehensive permit cannot independently challenge those rules and regulations. They give the Board of Appeals, again, a chance to level the playing field. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. Next slide, Angus, please. So there's two critical definitions in the statute. Again, the statute's very, very limited in terms of its breadth, but there are two critical definitions. The first one is called consistent with local needs. And a synonym for consistent with local needs is safe harbor. So when you hear the phrase safe harbor, it's a reference to the statute's definition of consistent with local needs and vice versa. So what does it mean? It means that if a municipality is at consistent with local needs status, the Board of Appeals decision cannot be appealed by the developer to the Housing Appeals Committee. We need to back up just for a second. When a developer receives a comprehensive permit decision from the Board of Appeals, it may appeal that decision to the Housing Appeals Committee, which is a state administrative agency that is intending to and is designed for the approval of comprehensive permit projects. The Housing Appeals Committee has shown no love for cities and towns in the Commonwealth over the past 45 years. That's a fact, that's not an opinion, and it's very important that the Board of Appeals feel comfortable with that fact. In order to avoid a review by the Housing Appeals Committee, a municipality needs to be consistent with local needs or at safe harbor. Those are synonyms. So how do we get to safe harbor? There are 3 ways to do so under the statute and 4 ways to do so under the regulations. The statutory mechanism, the most common referred to mechanism, is that 10% of the city or town's housing stock is deemed affordable. Now, what that means is not necessarily what the average person would define as affordable. For example, mobile homes are affordable, but they don't count towards your 10% status. So affordable is defined by the state as meeting certain income criteria, certain fair housing marketing criteria, and a permanent or long-term restriction on affordability. So 10% of the town's housing stock would need to meet those criteria to be consistent with local needs. Another method is called the 1.5% land area requirement, where 1.5% of the town's housing stock, 1.5% of the town's land area, rather, consists of housing stock that meets the state's definition of affordability. And then there are other safe harbor mechanisms that we're going to talk about in a minute. Based on what I can determine from the reports that are available publicly, West Newbury is not consistent with local needs in terms of the 10% requirement, in terms of the 1.5% requirement, or in terms of a certified housing production plan. But we'll talk about this in a second. The Board of Appeals has an opportunity to verify that within 15 days of the opening of a public hearing. So next slide, Angus, and we can build on this conversation. If the municipality is consistent with local needs, the Board of Appeals can approve the project with conditions or deny the project, and the applicant does not have an appeal to the Housing Appeals Committee. That decision of the Board of Appeals is final as to the applicant. And that's why this carrot and stick approach has stayed on the books for so long. The carrot is get to one of those consistent with local needs status. The stick is, if you don't, the Housing Appeals Committee is likely going to overturn the Board of Appeals decision. So that's the second bullet. If the municipality is not consistent with local needs, the applicant has a right to appeal to the Housing Appeals Committee. If you are consistent with local needs, and many cities and towns in the Commonwealth are, the Board of Appeals can still approve comprehensive permit projects. And in fact, they still do. Cambridge is a really good example. It's well over its 10% subsidized housing inventory, but yet it's still approving comprehensive permit projects. The difference is, in Cambridge, a developer who is not happy with the Board of Appeals decision has no appeal. In towns that are not consistent with local needs, the developer does have an appeal, and the appeal is to a very unfriendly forum, and that's the Housing Appeals Committee. Next slide, Angus. The second critical definition, and the one that is even more critical than the first for cities and towns that are not consistent with local needs, is this phrase uneconomic. And many people would argue that uneconomic is the most important word found in the statute. And what it means is that the developer is entitled to a certain profit on a for sale project or on a rental project. And if the Board of Appeals conditions the project too much, reduces the development density by too many units, imposes too many requirements, then the developer will argue that he or she or it is not getting the profit that they're entitled to, and they will appeal to the Housing Appeals Committee. Uneconomic is a bright line test. It either is or it isn't. And the Board of Appeals needs to know whether it's going to cause their conditions, their imposition of requirements, to make the project uneconomic. If the project is not made uneconomic, then the Housing Appeals Committee must leave the decision alone. If the project is made uneconomic, then the Housing Appeals Committee will overturn the decision. Now, that's a crude way of saying it. There's more detail to it, but from 1,000 miles high, that's the important point. Next slide, Angus, please. So the first step to applying for a comprehensive permit in a city or town in the Commonwealth is to obtain what is called the project eligibility letter, but you should think of it as a ticket. It's a ticket of entry to the town of West Newbury. Only people with tickets can apply for a comprehensive permit. So how do you get the ticket? You apply to Mass Housing or another agency called Massachusetts Housing Partnership, and you apply for a ticket. You pay a fee, you fill out a form, you provide some details, and the ticket will be issued. They are rarely denied. Rarely denied. And they're rarely denied because these two agencies are in the business of promoting the development of housing. They wouldn't be very good agencies if they weren't issuing the ticket that facilitated the housing that they're in business to provide. So while some have been denied, they are few and far between. Mass Housing will request comments from the municipality. I know the Board of Selectmen is aware of that. Those comments sometimes are responded to, oftentimes they're ignored. More often, Mass Housing will put in their ticket letter, their project eligibility letter, that the developer should consider the following things. The developer should take into account comments from the Board of Selectmen or the Planning Board. But it won't be a shall, it'll be a should. So we should assume for now that the project eligibility letter for a comprehensive permit application in West Newbury, whether it's tomorrow or 5 years from now, that project eligibility letter will be issued. The letter itself is good for 2 years, and it will say that on the letter, but they are routinely extended for long periods of time. So while the letter will say this letter is good for 2 years, it's extendable almost indefinitely. Next slide. Now, once an applicant receives the project eligibility letter, they can now apply to the Board of Appeals. So here's where the local regulations come into play. When I apply for a permit in West Newbury or anywhere, I'm following the rules that the Planning Board or the Board of Appeals or the Board of Selectmen have established. And here, those rules are really important. Both procedurally, how many copies of the plans need to be filed, what scale should the plans be drawn at, but more substantively, what does West Newbury care about in terms of design, in terms of spacing, in terms of landscape, in terms of architectural design, in terms of historic preservation, in terms of preservation of views and vistas for the river, for example. Those need to be articulated in the local rules and regulations for them to have the force of law. And that's why from the get-go, we really want to have robust local regulations. The degree of burden, the degree of difficulty is up to the Board of Appeals. It's certainly not up to me as an outsider, it's up to the Board of Appeals. But it's very important that those local rules and regulations be in place and be as articulate as possible as to what West Newbury wants for and from new comprehensive permit developments. Now, the statute is full of procedural traps for the unwary. And whether that was by design or it just happens, it doesn't really matter. So they're worth covering, albeit quickly. And the first is the Board of Appeals must open the public hearing within 30 days of receipt of the application. Must open the public hearing within 30 days of receipt. Many times boards of appeals will get incomplete applications. And the question always is, should we tell the developer we're not opening the hearing until he or she provides the missing data? And the answer is don't do it. Open the public hearing even if it's an incomplete application. Because if you don't, you're running the risk of a constructive grant on an appeal to the Housing Appeals Committee. It is too risky. You may be 100% correct that the application is only 75% complete. Do not run the risk of losing on a constructive grant by arguing that 25% was missing. There'll be a time and place for that, but make sure the board, and this is directly to the Board of Appeals, make sure you open that public hearing within 30 days. In order to open the public hearing, as the board knows, they must advertise 2 consecutive weeks, 14 days prior to the hearing. So that normal process, like a special permit or a variance, takes hold. We now open the public hearing. Now, could the applicant request an extension of time within which to open the public hearing? Yes, of course. And that request should be filed with the town clerk, and then it's continued to a date certain. But let's assume, for argument's sake, that there's no request for an extension, there's no request, or there's no extension granted. So day 1, I file. Within day 30, there must be a public hearing, and prior to that public hearing, there must have been proper notice and advertisement. Once the public hearing is open, the Board of Appeals must close it within 180 days. Open within 30, close within 180 unless extended by the applicant, or once again, run the risk of a constructive grant. We never want that to happen. Just as a footnote, the statute allows the public hearing to remain open until the Board of Appeals decides to close it. The regulations conflict with that. Requires the Board of Appeals to close it within 180 days. There's an argument to be made there, but let's not do that now. Open within 30, close within 180. Within 40 days of the close, the ZBA must vote and file its decision. 30 to open, 180 days worth of hearing, plus 40 to close and render a decision. Now, under the governor's orders and several orders because of COVID-19, the permitting deadlines have all been extended, and they are including 40B applications. But let's not talk about that now, just because that just gets more confusing. The governor's orders are relevant, but let's just assume that we don't have COVID-19, wishful thinking, we don't have it, and we don't have those orders that we have to concern ourselves with. So right now it's 30 to open, 180 to close, and then 40 to file. Angus, next slide, please.
John, if you could, not to interrupt, but if you could just speak a bit to the current comment period with Mass Housing, and just to clarify that there's no actual permit before the town, so the tolling that you referred to with COVID-19 does not apply.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Angus. So it doesn't apply pursuant to the order, and Mass Housing hasn't shown that it's kind of playing ball with the order. So no, your comment period of 30 days, you can ask for an extension, and Mass Housing will routinely grant 1 extension, sometimes 2. But no, that is not considered a permit or an approval. It's a ticket. It's a discretionary process that Mass Housing in and of itself controls. So no, that would not be part of the governor's COVID-19 orders. But if you are feeling pressure in terms of time to offer comments to Mass Housing, my advice would be to ask them for an extension of time. The assertion of safe harbor, if the Board of Appeals feels that safe harbor can be asserted, is in dramatic conflict with the statute. And again, we can discuss at some other point about what to do about this conflict, but right now it's really, really important. Within 15 days of the opening of the public hearing, the Board of Appeals must declare safe harbor if it believes there is a safe harbor. If the board fails to do that, it will be lost for that particular project. Put otherwise, don't make that mistake, because if you don't play that invocation of safe harbor within 15 days of the opening of the hearing, you will not be able to argue it later. So if the Board of Appeals concludes that West Newbury is meeting any of the safe harbor criteria, and we're going to talk more about that in just a moment, it must invocate that. It must state it within 15 days of the opening of the hearing, and there are requirements as to what it has to do thereafter. So this is really, really important. The statute says that the claim of safe harbor only needs to be made before the close of the hearing, which is months after the application. So remember, again, this is directed to the Board of Appeals, if you believe that there is safe harbor in the town, you have to assert it within 15 days of the opening of the hearing. The last bullet on this slide is equally important, which is the Board of Appeals must assert safe harbor each and every time you get a comprehensive permit application. It does not run with the town, so to speak. You have to assert it. If there are 5 comprehensive permit applications between now and the next 3 years, each time the Board of Appeals gets a comprehensive permit application, within 15 days of the opening of the public hearing, it must assert safe harbor. It's a very important step. And it's, again, dramatically inconsistent with the statute. Next slide, please, Angus. So there are 3 statutory safe harbors and 4 regulatory safe harbors. What's the difference? Well, the difference is in the detail, but in terms of protecting the town of West Newbury, there is no difference. The statute and the regs both are at play here. The statute adopted by the legislature, the regulations adopted by an arm of the governor's office called the Department of Housing and Community Development. The 3 statutory safe harbors are 10% of the housing stock is included on the subsidized housing inventory. The second is 1.5% of the land area is including subsidized housing inventory units. And the third is an annual land area construction amount, which is almost not impossible, but very difficult to achieve. The regulatory safe harbors are that the town has a housing production plan, and thereafter, after it's been approved by the Commonwealth, DHCD, the town builds subsidized housing inventory housing units to the tune of 0.5% per year, or the town increases its subsidized housing inventory by 2% of its total housing units, or the developer files what's called a large project, which is based on the town's population and the number of units that they apply for. Or fourth, the applicant was denied a non-40B project on the very same land that it now files for a 40B application within 1 year. There's a lot baked into these 7 statutory and regulatory safe harbors, and I'm happy to discuss them further with questions, but the devil's going to be in the details. And from what I can tell from afar, West Newbury doesn't have 10% subsidized housing inventory. I haven't done the 1.5% land area calculation. The board might want to consider doing that. And I doubt that the application you're going to see down the road will meet the 0.3 of 1% or 10-acre minimum. On the regulatory side, I know that the town's working on a housing production plan, and it needs to then meet that 0.5% production criteria, or a large project. Applicant comes in at a very large project, or a related application. So again, it will depend on the application that's filed with the Board of Appeals in order for the board to determine whether it wants to invoke safe harbor. But let's just take a quick second and talk about a large project example. Let's say that—
1 second. So all of these have equal weight, I guess you would say. The statutory and the regulatory have equal weight in terms of their importance?
Yeah, great question, actually. Yes, they are equivalent. So regardless of what the board says is the criteria of meeting safe harbor, they would all protect the town against an appeal to the Housing Appeals Committee. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah. They're all equivalent. The only difference in some is some are temporal. They won't last very long. For example, the housing production plan and increase of housing, that's an annual requirement. The 10% SHI, that'll stay until the census changes for the most part. So some are long-term, some are short-term, but they all have the same equivalency. They block an appeal to the Housing Appeals Committee. Next slide, Angus, please. Now, an applicant who applies for a comprehensive permit is going to ask for waivers from a whole host of local rules and regulations. In some instances, an applicant might ask for a waiver of 1 or 2 aspects of the zoning bylaw, but in other applications, it might be 50% of the zoning bylaw, or the subdivision regulations, or a local wetlands bylaw, or local Board of Health rules and regulations, or sign code, or general bylaws. The list is endless, because the thing about 40B is for cities and towns that are not consistent with local needs, the applicant can request a waiver from all local rules and regulations. The only thing the Board of Appeals cannot grant a waiver from is Title V, which is the Sanitary Code, the Building Code, or the Wetlands Protection Act, Endangered Species Act, and other state agency actions as well. But the three big ones are Title V, the Building Code, and the Wetlands Protection Act. So an applicant who applies for a comprehensive permit with the Board of Appeals is going to include in its application a list of waivers, a so-called waiver list. And the question that the Board of Appeals is going to be faced with is, what waivers should we grant? And the answer should be, we grant waivers to keep the project from becoming uneconomic. Because if the waiver is not necessary to keep the project from becoming uneconomic, the Board of Appeals needs to ask the question, well, why would we grant it? The entire purpose of the statute, to produce below market rate housing, is hinged on this phrase of uneconomic, and the presumption that local rules and regulations should not be waived, should not be cast aside. So the test is, if an applicant needs the waiver to keep the project from becoming uneconomic, the board should grant that waiver. But if the applicant can't demonstrate that, then why would the Board of Appeals grant waivers to something that can't be demonstrated, that there's no rational argument for why the waiver should be granted? Now, you'll hear many people argue that waivers should be granted to facilitate the project. Well, that's up to the Board of Appeals. That's not up to me or up to the applicant. But the legal test is, does the waiver need to be granted to keep the project from becoming uneconomic? Yes or no? If the answer is no, then the applicant's got to provide the Board of Appeals with a good design or public safety or other reasonable rationale for why to grant the waiver. Otherwise, why did we all go to town meeting the past 50 years and adopt rules and regulations if a developer can simply ask to have them cast aside? The legal test is that waiver is needed to keep the project from becoming uneconomic. In that case, grant the waiver, because otherwise we're going to lose at the Housing Appeals Committee. The last bullet is the way I like to explain it. This is the way I think about waivers. The ZBA is not required to grant the waiver if, but for the waiver, the project would not be rendered uneconomic. In other words, do we need the waiver to keep the project from becoming uneconomic? Remember, uneconomic is the most important definitional term in the statute. Angus, next slide, please. So this phrase, consistent with local needs, remember, two big definitions for us, uneconomic and consistent with local needs. I bolded the language from the definition in the statute. That is the part to focus on. That the rules and regulations of the Board of Appeals, the requirements and regulations, can be imposed if, and then just stop there. What are the requirements and regulations that the Board of Appeals is going to impose? The zoning bylaw, the subdivision regulations, the Board of Health regulations, all local rules and regulations are consistent with local needs if they are needed to, and now if you look at the bolded language, protect the health and safety of the housing units and the residents of the town, to promote better site and building design, and to preserve open spaces. This is right from the statute. So if the Board of Appeals believes that they need to impose the zoning bylaw, meaning not grant waivers from density or height or bulk or setback requirements, if the Board of Appeals believes that the waiver should be denied to protect open space, to protect and promote better building design, then the board may do that, and it will be consistent with local needs. And that is how the statute works. But here's the warning. The Housing Appeals Committee for the past 35, 40 years has shown very little sensitivity to municipal concerns. And again, they're in the business of creating more housing. They wouldn't be doing a great job if they sided with cities and towns very often, and they don't. So the Board of Appeals needs to be careful in its interpretation of this particular section. Preserve open spaces. Well, does that mean we're entitled just to deny the project? No, it's a balancing test. And we're dealing with a very old statute, and we're dealing with a very, very sensitive issue, the creation of more housing. So the Board of Appeals needs to be careful and mindful, and I know it will be, in terms of the balance between the protection of health and safety and the application for a large housing development or a small housing development under 40B. Next slide, Angus. Now, the third rail of a 40B application before a Board of Appeals always comes down to this. Because the statute puts so much weight, and the courts have put so much weight on this phrase uneconomic, the question is, how does the Board of Appeals know when a project is being rendered uneconomic? So remember, if the Board of Appeals renders the project uneconomic, the board's going to lose at the Housing Appeals Committee. That violates the cardinal principle of the statute. So how will the board know whether it can impose conditions for a left turn lane, better landscaping, better site design, more open space? How will the board know when it's deliberating with the applicant how many conditions it can impose? An applicant comes in at 150 units, the board thinks that's too much for the particular site. Can they cut it down to 130, to 120? How will the board know whether that will render the project uneconomic? The only way of knowing that is to require the applicant to provide what's called the pro forma, the project pro forma. Every applicant for a comprehensive permit has already prepared one because they've submitted it to Mass Housing as part of their project eligibility application. The Board of Appeals is entitled to the pro forma. Now, you're going to hear from others who will tell you the Board of Appeals cannot require the pro forma, and that's wrong. And then you're going to hear from others that will say the Board of Appeals can't engage in a detailed analysis of the project pro forma until the end of the project and the end of the public hearing, and that's wrong too. What the Board of Appeals cannot do is require the developer to reduce density until after the board has vetted the project in its entirety. But that does not mean the Board of Appeals cannot require and send out for peer review, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, the developer's pro forma. Without a pro forma, the Board of Appeals is driving with their eyes closed. You cannot render a decision on a comprehensive permit under the statute if we don't know what the project economics are. But there's going to be a lot of pushback when the Board of Appeals receives a comprehensive permit application, because the development community, aided in large part by DHCD, has argued that the project pro forma is not to be reviewed or discussed until the very end of the project. Excuse me, very end of the process. And of course, that is topsy-turvy. The project economics are what's driving the density. The Board of Appeals has the right to know whether that is a density that the developer needs to keep the project from becoming uneconomic. It's an essential ingredient. The Board of Appeals has the right to require it on day one as part of its comprehensive permit rules and regulations. And I'm happy to talk further about how to use the project pro forma, but the bottom line is the Board of Appeals needs it. It would be analogous to reviewing a development project without a site plan. Nobody would take that seriously. You can't take reviewing a 40B application seriously without a pro forma. Next slide, Angus. Now, one of the strongest statutory schemes we have in Massachusetts, and one that I urge boards of appeals, planning boards, conservation commissions, boards of health to use all the time because it's so beneficial for us, is Chapter 44, Section 53G. It allows a municipal body, including a Board of Appeals for comprehensive permits, to require an applicant for a complicated project to pay for the town's review of that project. the Board of Appeals requires the developer to pay for the assistance needed to review his or her project. So for example, if there is a groundwater or surface water supply that's sensitive near the proposed project, and we're worried about downgradient impacts from a septic system or a package treatment plant, the Board of Appeals might want to hire a hydrogeologist or a hydrologist. If it's a wetland impact, the board might want to hire a wetland scientist. If it's a public health issue, a sanitarian, Title V type of issue, an architect, a landscape architect, a civil engineer, a traffic engineer, a planner, a designer. Whatever the Board of Appeals feels is the skill set that it needs because the town itself doesn't have that skill set, or it wants to complement that skill set. The Board of Appeals can require the developer to pay for those services. The most important thing is that last bullet. These consultants are your consultants, not the applicants. They don't work for the applicant, they work for you. They have a fiduciary obligation and a professional obligation to you, the town. So they are your consultants. The applicant is paying for.
John, could I ask a question?
Of course.
So my understanding from what I've read, but there's been a query counter to this, is that it's totally to the ZBA's discretion, or at the ZBA's discretion, who they use, as long as they meet minimum qualifications, minimum competency in the field, that it is fully up to the ZBA with no consideration of the preference of the developer or the proponent. Is that correct?
100% correct. The only thing I'd add, Archie, is that the consultant that the board chooses must be qualified and must not have a conflict of interest. So just adding that second piece, you're absolutely right, 100% correct. Now, it may be that the applicant will agree because he or she has used the same consultant and say, great, I trust that person. Or the applicant say, I don't trust that person isn't sympathetic or understanding. Still up to the Board of Appeals. So it's not a negotiable discussion. It's up to the Board of Appeals.
John, this is Melissa D'Amato. Can I ask another question?
Of course.
Is there a limit on the amount of cost with hiring these consultants or these, I don't know, what do you call them, experts? Is there a limit?
Great question.
On the price?
So the short answer is no, there's no limit, but remember the project uneconomic test. Every time you require me to pay for a consultant, $10,000 for a hydrologist, $15,000 for a civil engineer, $30,000 for a land planner, I am going to use that against you on the economics. So no, there is no limit, but just be mindful that it's not a blank check. And because of that, my advice to boards is to be conservative up front. Let's say we want 5 experts that we've identified we need support on. And those 5 experts run the gamut of the skill set. We're going to ask for $10,000 per expert, $50,000. All excess money that's not spent gets returned to the applicant by statute. And if we need more money for one particular expert, we'll ask for more money later on. So I wouldn't ask for more than you know you're going to need to spend from the beginning. I'd be conservative, but no, there is no statutory limit on what you require. Just be reasonable, because that number is going to be used as part of the uneconomic calculation. A challenge to who the Board of Appeals chooses as an expert. Let's say that the developer says that individual is not qualified, that individual is a conflict of interest. That challenge goes to the Board of Selectmen. It doesn't go back to the Board of Appeals. So a challenge as to who the ZBA requires to be retained as part of the 53G fund, that challenge goes to the Board of Selectmen. And the Board of Selectmen can only overturn the Board of Appeals decision if the Board of Selectmen concludes that the chosen consultant is not qualified or has a conflict of interest. So the Board of Selectmen's powers here are limited just to those 2 factors as well. I cannot stress enough the importance of using 53G. You have every right to use it for any project, not just comprehensive permits. You have the right to use it for any project where you would benefit from outside consulting services.
Do you, John, this is Rick Parker again. Do you have, based on what you've seen historically, is there any sort of rule of thumb for what you might assume would be fall within the still economic range in terms of percentage? Say if you were looking at you know, 1/4% of the overall project, you know, presumed project value, or 1/2%, could a number like that be considered to make the project uneconomic?
Yeah, great question, Rick. Probably not. And again, the devil's in the details, but because if we're dealing with a large project, let's say any development over 20 units, the land costs are typically the highest cost, and then the construction costs are next. It would be really a very poorly designed and poorly financed project if $100,000 of consulting fees rendered the project uneconomic. I mean, very few developers would come in with that kind of low margin. Now, if it were a nonprofit or a public agency, if the town were to be the applicant, and the town can be a 40B applicant, or a nonprofit, then I'd be a little more careful. But no private developer, no competent private developer is going to come in at the beginning with a margin that would render the project uneconomic at a $50,000 or $100,000 imposition of 53G fees. So you're unlikely to encounter the uneconomic situation just because of 53G. All I'm saying is it's part of the list the Board of Appeals has to be mindful of. So in addition to, say, $50,000 or $100,000 for 53G money, we're going to want a left turn lane, and we're going to want some additional open space and some better stormwater mitigation, and we're going to want to reduce the density by 10%. Now the numbers have started to go up. 53G in and of itself, I cannot imagine that would render a project in and of itself uneconomic. Start small, because again, it's the developer's money. You're not trying to steal their money. So start small. You're going to get proposals from consultants, and they're going to say, yeah, I can do this peer review for $7,000. So require the developer to cough up $7,500, $8,000 for that particular requirement. If you need more, you can require more. If you don't spend it, then you're required to return it. So start small. I wouldn't start with a huge number just because it's confrontational to begin with. Start with a reasonable number, and the Board of Appeals can always ask for more.
There is no problem with asking for more later.
No, there isn't. And in fact, I'm glad you mentioned that, Rick, because the town cannot engage third-party consultants unless the money is in the bank. So unless the money is deposited with the town treasurer as a special account under 53G, the town cannot authorize those services. So if I'm your consultant and I've spent $7,500 worth of services and I'm out of money, I have to stop work. There's no accrual process under municipal law, municipal finance law. So the money must be in the account.
Great, thank you.
Sure, start small, and you can always require
John, Mike McCarron.
Yes, Mike.
You might counterbalance this uneconomic with also the concept that the applicant is a limited dividend corporation and how that plays in.
So the limited dividend corporation means that it's part of the statutory requirement. It means that they will be limiting their profit to that set by the subsidizing agency. And it's going to differ if it's a sale project versus a rental project. So for example, a sale project, the subsidizing agency, in this case, Mass Housing, or most cases, Mass Housing, because there's really, the subsidy is a bit of an illusion. There is no federal subsidy anymore, and there are very few state subsidies. The money to fund this project, or a 40B project, is coming from private banks. Mass Housing is playing a quasi-subsidy role by issuing this project eligibility letter. They will limit the profit of a developer for a for-sale project, for example, to 20% of total development costs. Now, that's a pretty hefty profit, and the developer has to show that they are not exceeding that 20% profit. If they do, the money in the old days was to be returned back to the town. Today, the money gets returned to mass housing. Very few developers, very, very few developers have ever exceeded that maximum limited dividend that Mike just mentioned. And the reason why is they'll just spend more money on the project. So most developers are very mindful of what that cap is, and no developer wants to return money to the Commonwealth, let alone to the municipality. So we rarely see a developer exceed that profit. What we have seen is cities and towns go after developers for excess profit to some degree of success. The Inspector General of the Commonwealth 12 years ago went on a very broad multi-year investigation as to excess profits. But when Mike mentions this notion of limited dividend, that's what it means, that the developer has a cap on its profit. It's not really something that the Board of Appeals has much negotiable room with. The Board of Appeals needs to be aware of not lowering its profit below the subsidized housing requirement, meaning don't allow or don't impose conditions that leaves a developer with a profit of less than 20%. Typically, the rule of thumb for the number to use is 15% for a for-sale project and 10% per year of a return on a rental project. The numbers get in the way here, and it's very hard to have a conversation about the numbers in a vacuum. The Board of Appeals really needs to review the pro forma for a for-sale project and try to work within the profit cap, 15 to 20%, so that the board knows that it can impose conditions or reduce density or require third-party consultants, so the developer will still achieve its 15 or 20% profit. Next slide, thanks. When the Board of Appeals opens the public hearing, it must close it within 180 days. And very often, the developer will not have provided the Board of Appeals with all the details that the board's looking for. It won't provide information on either groundwater impacts or design alternatives or open space set aside. We're getting down towards the 180-day day, and the Board of Appeals still has more information that it's been requesting and wants, and the developer says, no, I'm not going to provide anything else. So when that happens, the Board of Appeals is now faced with the problem of, what do we do? We're running up against the 180-day clock, and we don't have everything we've asked for. The board should close the hearing before the 180 days expire, even if the applicant has not provided the information the board has sought. Much like I said before, if the applicant files an incomplete application, the board should open the hearing, just because the board will lose on a constructive approval. If the applicant refuses to provide the board the information the board's looking for, the board still has to close the hearing within 180 days. Do not push that, because the applicant will file an appeal with the Housing Appeals Committee as a constructive approval, and that's not what we want to have happen. If the applicant refuses to produce the information the board has asked for, the good faith information the board believes it needs, then the minutes should reflect that the applicant has failed to provide that information. The board should send a letter to the applicant and or its counsel saying, we've asked you for this, we've asked you for that, and you haven't produced it, so at least it's part of the record. But at the end of the day, the board has to be very mindful of these time clocks. They're exact. There's no flexibility unless the applicant grants an extension. Next slide, thanks. So we're now at the end of the process. The board's closed the public hearing. We now have 40 days to render a decision. So what is the decision? Well, it's an approval with no conditions. That rarely, if ever, happens. It's an approval with conditions, or it's a denial for reasons. If the project is denied, or if the applicant is not satisfied with the approval with conditions, the applicant will appeal to the Housing Appeals Committee. If the town is consistent with local needs, has met one of the safe harbors, then the applicant has no appeal to the Housing Appeals Committee. At the same time, if the board approves the project with conditions, and a butter, someone with standing to appeal the board's decision to court, Superior Court or Land Court, takes their appeal under an entirely different statutory scheme, where both the developer and the abutter appeals, which happens a lot, where both the developer and the abutter appeals, the abutter's appeal is stayed, frozen, for the entire time the developer's appeal is litigated at the Housing Appeals Committee, and then if it happens in Superior Court, and then if it goes on to the Appeals Court or the Supreme Judicial Court, it stayed through that process as well. The abutter's appeal does not get heard until after the ZBA's case is exhausted. And that, of course, can take years. When the abutter appeals and the developer appeals, the same Board of Appeals decision, they go to different places, and the abutter's appeal gets stayed, frozen, until the developer's appeal is litigated and resolved. And again, that can take many, many, many years. We've seen cases sometimes be 8 or 9 or 10 years throughout this elongated process. Now, if we just take a look at the second bullet for a second, if the project is denied or if it's approved with conditions. When a Board of Appeals is faced with a project that it does not feel it can approve, common sense would say it should disapprove it. And that's just the way we think about land use permitting. If you can't meet the qualifications or the requirements of the zoning bylaw, the project's going to be disapproved. But in 40B, disapproval of a project carries with it a lot of exposure for the board and for the town. When a 40B application is disapproved and the town is not consistent with local needs, the burden of proof shifts to the town, to the board, to show that there is some imperiling, some threatening situation that this project is going to cause. Dramatic. The bar is very high in terms of impacts this project will cause. If it's an approval with conditions, the burden is on the applicant to show that the conditions render the project uneconomic. So even though it's counterintuitive, especially for regulatory boards and bodies, even though it's counterintuitive, you got a project that's not complying with our rules and regulations, we should deny it. In a comprehensive permit, the board really wants to think twice about that, because a denial shifts the burden to the town. And if you are not consistent with local needs, it's almost impossible to prevail. Almost impossible to prevail. When it's an approval with conditions, the burden is on the developer to show those conditions render it uneconomic. It's still difficult for the town to prevail, but it's not impossible. So it's very difficult for a Board of Appeals to articulate this to the public when hypothetically you have just a horrific project that doesn't meet any normative planning standards. It's going to cause havoc on a whole bunch of substantive areas. Common sense would say deny it. Tell the developer to come back with a more reasonable project. But when it's a comprehensive permit, that sometimes is not the right approach, even as counterintuitive as it is. And I just warn the ZBA members kind of in a friendly way. It's a very hard thing to explain to the public because the public is demanding denial and you're arguing burdens of proof. And that sometimes is a hard conversation to have in a public setting. But it's something for the ZBA to be aware of.
John, can we go back a bit to your comments about the abutters appeal?
Sure.
So, so you mentioned that the ZBA goes through an appeal process. You stepped us through very nicely. Thank you for that. how that happens. And you mentioned that it can take years to go through that process. And then after that process has been completed, the abutters have an opportunity to appeal that decision.
No, can I just interrupt? Let me just interrupt for a second.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
the Board of Appeals rendered its decision, let's say last week. The developer will have 20 days to appeal that decision to the Housing Appeals Committee, and the abutters will have the same 20 days to appeal that same decision to Superior Court. That appeal, the abutters appeal, is the one that is now going to be on ice until the developer's appeal is exhausted.
And then when does the abutters appeal? So assuming the abutters appeal starts after that process, and then you had mentioned it could take several more years for the abutters appeal to work its way through the system. During the abutters appeal, do we have the same guidelines that the zoning board had in terms of getting peer review studies done, all the same things that we just stepped through for the zoning board appeal?
No, great question. So the abutter is challenging the ZBA's decision, and now it's being reviewed by the Superior Court or the Land Court. So no, and that gets to another important concept for the Board of Appeals to really struggle with, because this is another difficult part. The Board of Appeals is going to hold 180 days worth of public hearings. You're going to spend a lot of time on this, on a comprehensive permit application, a lot of material, a lot of detail. When it's appealed to the Housing Appeals Committee, the Housing Appeals Committee reviews it de novo, meaning from the beginning, as if nothing happened at the Board of Appeals level. So the Board of Appeals 6-month process starts all over again at the Housing Appeals Committee. Everything that took place at the Board of Appeals hearings, other than the decision, become somewhat irrelevant. The developer has now appealed to the Housing Appeals Committee. We start from the beginning, and that's what we mean by de novo. So all the effort you do at the local level, at the Board of Appeals level, to create this record so you can render a competent decision becomes not irrelevant, but almost mooted, because at the Housing Appeals Committee, we start all over again. So that's what makes this so complicated. When the developer appeals the Board of Appeals decision, it goes to the Housing Appeals Committee and it starts de novo. Meanwhile, an abutters appeal, if there is one, is just sitting out there literally on ice until after the Housing Appeals Committee matter is resolved, either at the Housing Appeals Committee or in Superior Court or in the Appellate Court. And that's what could take years. So years later, after that's resolved, now we still have this abutter appeal. And now the abutter appeal is abutter versus developer and Board of Appeals. The Board of Appeals is now a defendant in the case where you were actually rendering a decision that the developer itself disagreed with. So it becomes very, very complicated and extremely drawn out over time.
Thank you. Thank you. That's helpful. And then I have one more question. I'm sorry for all my questions.
Sure, of course.
You had mentioned peer review, and I was speaking with somebody, and I believe they said that when you hire, so the developer, let's just say we want to have a peer review done of the wetlands, right? Is it true that, and it has to be somebody that the zoning board approves, so it's not the builder's wetlands consultant. Is it true that the peer review person that the zoning board and I guess the abutters would hire
Not the abutters. I'm sorry to interrupt you. And I'm sorry because I can't see it. It's not the abutters. This decision on peer review is solely up to the Board of Appeals.
Okay, so Board of Appeals. Is the peer review person that's hired by the Board of Appeals, can they only address the items that the builder addressed in his application? In other words, can they identify new issues with the project that have not been identified in the builder's application?
Yes, excellent question. Absolutely. And in fact, that's really why the peer review consulting process is so important. And let's give the developer a fair shake here. Developer files an application, not trying to hide anything, but the developer's consultant missed an important component of the hydrology or the wetland science, or overlooked something that your peer reviewer would catch. No. Your peer reviewer is your consultant, and you've hired them to provide whatever scope of services you've hired them to do. And that is both the review of the developer's plans, but also offsite impacts, downgrading impacts, bigger cumulative impacts of a project while looking at the regional watershed, for example. No, they are not limited at all. That's a really important question. They do not have blinders on. You've hired them to provide comprehensive review of a complicated project, and that's what their scope of work should be.
Excellent. I'll stop asking questions. Thank you.
No. Please do. Angus, I think next slide.
Yeah, but before you go on, John, there was a question that came in through the chat, which is a good question, and that is, does the town have the same rights to consultants at the HAC?
So if the town is appealed, if the Board of Appeals decision is appealed to the Housing Appeals Committee, in order to defend the Board of Appeals decision, the board's going to need experts. They usually are the same experts the board has used locally during the public hearing process, but of course now the town has to pay for those experts. During the Board of Appeals process, you've hired ABC company to do civil engineering and XYZ to do hydrology. At the Board of Appeals, the applicant is paying for ABC and XYZ. Now on appeal to the Housing Appeals Committee, we're now in litigation. The town will have to pay for ABC and XYZ. So they will be typically the same consultant, although they don't have to be. You're not wed to them because you use them locally. But in terms of who's going to pay for them, the town will be paying for them during the litigation process, whereas you didn't pay for them during the public hearing process.
Thank you.
Next slide, Angus.
Yep, there we go.
So the Housing Appeals Committee, there's a lot written about the Housing Appeals Committee. Most of their decisions are online. If you go to their webpage, just Massachusetts Department of Housing and Community Development or Mass Housing Appeals Committee. Very controversial decisions, a lot written about it. And again, my opinion is not relevant other than to say they are not in business to protect West Newbury. I don't think even they would disagree with that. Their job is to promote more affordable housing, and the way to do that is to approve comprehensive permit projects. So the Board of Appeals is always wary of the Housing Appeals Committee. They have created a system where it's not a friendly environment for cities and towns on purpose, and it is what it is. And we work with that. But the Housing Appeals Committee is an administrative agency at the state level, so they function under a whole different set of rules than we function at the local level. They function under what's called the Administrative Procedures Act, and they have a lot of deferential authority. The Housing Appeals Committee is rarely overturned when they are brought to court. They have made some serious errors, and they have lost, and I'm happy to talk about any one of those, but as a general rule, they prevail. Courts defer to them. Courts have shown very little sensitivity to cities and towns that disapprove comprehensive permit projects, and that's not meant to put any kind of negative light on it. It's just the way it is, and that's why cities and towns have to be very flexible and very pragmatic in dealing with comprehensive permit projects. But the thing that's worth mentioning now, even though it seems so in the weeds, when the Housing Appeals Committee renders a decision, it is appealed to the court, Superior Court or Land Court, When it's appealed on the record that's created at the Housing Appeals Committee, meaning the court does not hear new testimony. So the Housing Appeals Committee is a really important place for the town to defend its decisions. Because if it's not in the record established at the Housing Appeals Committee, the record meaning literally the paper and the transcript, then the court will not hear it. The court does not hear new testimony. And the reason I mention that is it's the opposite of de novo. So the two types of review in Massachusetts and across the country are on the record, which is an appeal of a Housing Appeals Committee decision, meaning the assembled paperwork, or de novo, from the beginning. When the ZBA's decision is appealed to the Housing Appeals Committee, the Housing Appeals Committee hears it de novo. When the Housing Appeals Committee's decision is appealed to court, it's reviewed on the record. Generally speaking, on the record reviews favor the administrative agencies and disfavor cities and towns. And there's a reason why it's set up that way. But I just thought I'd mention that as kind of in the weeds as that conversation is. Next slide, Angus.
John, one of the questions that just came in through the chat is whether the costs related to abutter appeals factor into whether a project is uneconomic.
That's a great question. No. The costs of an abutter appeal will be after the Board of Appeals renders its decision. So the applicant might try to introduce that at the Housing Appeals Committee, but that is a much different conversation than the one we're having tonight. So for the purposes of the Board of Appeals pro forma review, no, the abutters haven't challenged it yet because they can't, because there's no decision. So no, that's not something the Board of Appeals needs to worry about at all. The Board of Appeals needs to be cognizant of impacts on abutting and downgrading of property and neighborhood character and all the things that we've talked about. But no, that part of the economics is not relevant for the Board of Appeals consideration during the public hearing and the decision process. Yeah, that's a great question.
Thanks.
So this is just where we left off. What happens if both parties, the developer and the abutter appeal, the abutter's appeal gets frozen and the developer's appeal goes first? Could there be multiple abutter appeals? Of course. Oftentimes the town will try and consolidate those. I defer to Mike on strategy for that, but there could be, and there often are, multiple abutter appeals. But the most important thing for our conversation is the Board of Appeals needs to be focused on rendering its decision within the time period allotted, and then rendering a decision watching out for the line of economic and uneconomic, and then literally whatever's going to happen is going to happen. Abutters are going to appeal, the developers are likely going to appeal, and the Board of Appeals is going to do the best it can to render the strongest, most protective decision possible. This is a little out of context, but I just want to mention it. One thing we haven't talked about is what is comprehensive permit or affordable housing in Massachusetts. And it's just worth noting that the typical target market for comprehensive permit projects these days is 80% of median income. So if I come in with a 100-unit comprehensive permit project, 75% of those units will be market rate. They'll sell it whatever the market will support. And 25%, some programs it's 20%, but most are 75, 25. Those 25% of the units, the so-called affordable units, will sell or rent to individuals earning 80% of median income. That's the target group. Now, there are some programs in some areas of the Commonwealth where the numbers are lower, where we're targeting a lower income population, but the norm is 80% of median. And I should add, I've heard this before all these years, these units are not Section 8 housing units. Section 8 housing units do not qualify for the town's subsidized housing inventory. If West Newbury had 50 Section 8 certificates, they don't count towards your affordable housing inventory. And the philosophy there is because Section 8 certificates don't tie themselves to a unit, they tie themselves to an individual. I hold a Section 8 certificate, I can move from one unit to another. 40B is all about the production of new housing. So the department has never allowed Section 8 certificates to count. So the units that get built in comprehensive permit projects, the 25% below market, the so-called affordable units, are targeting a population or an income population of 80% of median. And I just throw that out anecdotally just because one of the myths of 40B is this really uncertainty as to who these units are being targeted towards. So next slide, thanks, please. And that's it, yeah. So I be happy to answer other questions, Angus, that that you or the board has, or however you wanted to proceed from here.
Okay, why don't we start with, we've got right now the Selectmen and the Board of Appeals members and town staff unmuted. So why don't we say, if there's any questions there, go ahead, and then once we, and then we can unmute everybody else and get into it.
Angus, because
Everyone, just so everyone's clear, the reason I mute everybody is really to limit background noise and to, you know, it's not, you know, and so that's the goal.
Angus, there's a good question. How close are we to the, you know, the 10% of affordable housing in the town? And I can't give you, but the answer is we're not anywhere near that number. That would be, I believe we're like less than 2% at the moment, is something like that.
Right now, we're at 2.5%. According to the housing production plan from June 2018, as of that time, we had 39 affordable units, or units that are counted as affordable on the state inventory. There have been a few added since then, but less than 10 and probably less than 5. In order to get to 10%, that's a total of 168 affordable units. So compared to 39, so that's we're quite a ways. And there are other safe harbor provisions, as John spoke to, and we can get into more of those. But the housing production plan and meeting the production goals set out in that is very challenging, partly because the town is not itself building the housing, and the town doesn't control the market. And even if the town was to approve mixed income developments that would allow for the construction of the 8 additional affordable units per year, even then the town doesn't control the timing of when the developer actually pulls the building permits. And as John knows well, it's very administratively challenging to get these units into the housing inventory through the local initiative program. So the logistics of when the building permit is issued, when the, you know, the occupancy has to be issued for a certain amount of time, for all of those stars to align is very challenging. Not to say it's impossible, but it's we're not there.
Hey, John, one of the questions we get, or I get fairly often, or the, you know, concerns is school impacts, traffic impacts, all those. How do those weigh into the zoning board's decision, and how much can they consider, or how much they need to ignore?
Yeah, a really important question. It's going to come up every comprehensive permit application. But let me say this. Schools are typically not something the Housing Appeals Committee will respect. Infrastructure limitations, not something the committee will respect. Any impact on the municipal budget, not something the committee will respect. So we have Housing Appeals Committee decision after decision after decision saying that if you lack infrastructure, you got to build it. If you lack school capacity, you got to provide it. If you don't have enough police or fire personnel, you got to provide for them. So those are never good grounds for denying a comprehensive permit. And the reason why is, and this kind of ties back to kind of standard zoning, it's the theory that if everyone's harmed, no one's harmed. Meaning that if a project is going to create impacts on schools, then the town is at fault for not providing enough school system or enough school capacity. And with the comprehensive permit law, it's even more, it's more highlighted. Never, ever deny a comprehensive permit project for limitations on public facilities. If, however, and your second comment, Sam, was related to traffic. If, however, this particular project will cause traffic issues that will endanger health and safety to the point where the fire chief, the police chief, and a traffic engineer will testify that people will be injured, then I'd say you can take it into account. But if it's generalized, more traffic is never going to be enough. More waiting at a left turn lane will never be enough. It's going to have to be dramatic for it to carry the day at the Housing Appeals Committee. And let me just say, in the 40 plus years of Housing Appeals Committee decisions, we've never seen traffic being a winning argument. We've seen roadway limitations, that the road is too narrow, that the road has imperfections that can't be resolved by the developer. Those sometimes will carry some weight, but as a general rule, even traffic is not a good grounds for a denial. Kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's very difficult to deny a comprehensive permit because the burden is going to shift to the town to show that people will literally be imperiled with life or some severe injury. It's very difficult to show. Generalized problems in the town, I would urge the Board of Appeals to stay away from it. Can you get the developer to pay for those improvements? Yes. If a developer is required to create the left turn lane or provide open space or provide additional infrastructure, the developer can be required to pay for that, be mindful of this uneconomic issue, but I would never deny based on a limited school capacity or limited public facilities. That has never won the day in 40B world. Excellent, thank you.
With that said, John, if you could just speak a bit to the water capacity issue, which is a very real concern here in town.
So, you know, kind of boiling it down to its most basic, in order to get a building permit, the developer has to show water and wastewater disposal, among other requirements. So if there is a development project that's going to demand X gallons per day of water and generate X gallons per day of wastewater, they have to be able to demonstrate beyond engineering or with engineering certainty that they have the ability to do that. So that's where water limitations come in, and that's where wastewater limitations come in. So if I'm going to build a packaged treatment plant, that's going to create mounted groundwater discharge. That discharge is going to filtrate down gradient to potentially private wells. That's a relevant issue for the Board of Appeals to be concerned about. When I develop a water supply that's going to potentially impact abutting or nearby private wells, that's something the Board of Appeals can require further information on. So water supply and wastewater disposal, because the Board of Appeals cannot waive Title V, and because the Housing Appeals Committee cannot waive Title V, those are relevant issues. Now, if it's a packaged treatment plant, you'll hear the developer perhaps argue that it's not Title V, it's beyond the Board of Health jurisdiction, and that's only half true. The Board of Health has jurisdiction over impact to private wells. Packaged treatment plants impact private wells, depending on where they're located. And while the Board of Health does not permit packaged treatment plants, that's permitted by DEP, the Board of Health has a role in the impact from a packaged treatment plant. And DEP sometimes does not look at the details that a Board of Health would look at. So when it's water and wastewater disposal, that's very different than schools and traffic. And those are issues that the Board of Appeals really needs to focus on, depending on the facts of the case. Those are relevant, and there's some good case law. One out of a town that I've represented for many, many years, there's really good case law on the impact of wastewater disposal on private wells, and that is an issue that the Board of Appeals has jurisdiction to consider. So in towns with limited infrastructure, like West Newbury, those are relevant issues, much more so than limitations on public facilities. Sam, did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I pretty much knew the answer, but it's one that I get either asked a lot or the comments are made a lot that, you know, the schools don't have the capacity, so they'll never get it through, or, you know, I saw a comment relating to the tri-town and how it impacts a tri-town school, and is that, you know, potentially reason to, turn this down. And, sort of knowing the answer, I just wanted to, get it out there, because it is something that people bring up often is traffic issues, school issues, and that there is either methods to correct them, traffic issues by, like you said, making a left-hand turn lane, or with the schools, again, if it's a shame on us for not having enough capacity, then, well, that's unfortunate for us. So I just wanted to highlight it, because it's something that I hear probably more frequently than anything is schools, roadways, and police and fire relating to 40B.
And those are things that are personal. We can all relate to them, so it makes sense. It's not, it's not that the comments that the board's going to hear are not relevant. There's relevance in life, and then there's relevance in law, and sometimes those two are very different. In 40B world, I think the board really needs to focus on both, but be mindful of the relevance in law, because the statute is not designed to be helpful. The statute is designed to carry a big stick, produce more housing, and if you don't, here are the consequences. And that's how 40B works. So if the statute and the regs allowed towns to use limited infrastructure or lack of school capacity as a weapon to deny comprehensive permits, well, then there wouldn't be many comprehensive permits approved. So clearly, the state has outthought us on that, and they're well ahead of us on that. They want you to approve more housing developments, and this is the way they want you to do it. And they've held out the carrot of get to safe harbor. But in small towns like West Newbury, it's very difficult to do. Even if the town had this as its top priority, build more housing, build more subsidized housing, you'd still have great difficulty, because your numerator and denominator are so out of whack, and it's not your fault. It's just the way it is. You just don't have enough units. So you're always going to be behind the curve. And that's why I say to the Board of Appeals, be very careful on a denial, because the burden shifts so dramatically to the town. It's very, very difficult to prosecute. Again, it's very fact specific. If the site that the application is proposed on is unable to handle the proposal based on water supply or wastewater or other infrastructural problems, well, then the board might have no choice. But as a general rule, as a rule of thumb, a denial is a very, very risky proposition.
Who regulates the quality of the housing that's built?
Another great question. So one of the Supreme Judicial Court cases that I had out of Amesbury, not too far from you, is kind of put the damper on what cities and towns can do relative to housing quality or housing location or the number of affordable units. So the answer to your question, Mr. Andrews, is that it's the state. Mass Housing would be the entity that would have jurisdiction over the quality of the housing. Now, the building commissioner, of course, under the state building code, but in terms of the quality of the appliances, the differentiation between market and below market, that is entirely now on Mass Housing. The case out of Amesbury tried to assert local control on things like that, and the Supreme Judicial Court said that we had no jurisdiction in that area. It was really a horrific decision in many respects, because 40B had been sold all these years as allowing cities and towns to retain local control, and this decision, it's called attached views, did just the opposite. So it stripped cities and towns of any programmatic opportunities, quality of the housing, the interior aspects of the housing, things like that. You can negotiate with the developer. You can ask the developer to do this or that, but the Board of Appeals lacks the authority to impose it as a condition.
John, there have been a couple of questions coming in through the text, and
We had the best belt. That's
that are related. So I'm going to,
it's a little late for it. Do it a couple times.
hold on. We're getting some feedback there. So the questions, I'm going to try to tie a couple of questions together. One is regarding the relationship with MEPA, and when would it be determined whether environmental impact study may or may not be required. And related to that is question about potential species
That's the loudest
habitat
I've ever
and
used with that
impact on.
bell. It's a nice bell. I got the
hold on.
best bell on the street.
Sorry, we got someone ringing a bell here. That's John. All right, sorry. So yeah, species impact or habitat impact on species of concern.
So the first question was MEPA. So the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act is a review process. It's not a permitting process. And it is required for some developments that trigger some things. For example, 300 parking spaces or more is typically a trigger under MEPA, along with a state permit. And in this case, the state permit, or in most 40B cases, the state permit would be an approval from Mass Housing, the project eligibility letter, and often that is considered state financing. So MEPA would be a requirement depending on the facts of the application. Larger projects trigger MEPA, and the trigger is called an environmental notification form. Very, very large projects trigger an environmental impact review. Most projects these days do not trigger EIRs, environmental impact review. So some projects do trigger an ENF. It's a pretty innocuous process. Developer submits a form, state agencies review it and comment on it. It sometimes happens during the Board of Appeals process, but rarely does. So most 40B developers will not file for their MEPA certificate, as it's called, their ENF, until after they get out of the Board of Appeals process. Under the regulations, they are supposed to file an ENF within 10 days of filing their appeal to the Housing Appeals Committee. So you can kind of see that is going to take it out of the Board of Appeals. Like I say, it's more rare than not that a developer will file MEPA early. If it is endangered species habitat, then that is another permitting process that the Board of Appeals has no jurisdiction over. They cannot waive, they cannot influence the outcome. The applicant would file with the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program for a project review, and that agency, which is a division of Fish and Wildlife, they issue a separate approval process called a Conservation and Management Permit. And again, that typically does not occur during the Board of Appeals process. It typically doesn't occur until after. And the theory there is most developers don't want to spend a lot of time and money with these peripheral applications until they know where they're standing after they get through the Board of Appeals. They fare favorably with the Board of Appeals and there's no abutter appeal, then they move typically to the next level. But if they're being kind of tied up with the ZBA and tied up with an abutter appeal, they're typically going to wait on these other approvals. There's no rhyme or reason to it, just typically they don't happen during the Board of Appeals process.
One question that came in that I just want to let everybody know, the question was asked whether your slides can be made available, and I want people to know that your slides were posted to the town website earlier this evening. So if people are familiar with the project page that's linked from the Board of Selectmen page, the link to John Witten's slides is embedded within that page. It's in the first bullet point. If you have a hard time finding that, just send me an email, and but they are up there. Oh, John, I know you spoke to this early, but if you could reiterate, there's been a number of questions about wetlands, vernal pools, and I know you said initially that the Conservation Commission, the Wetlands Protection Act, is one area that is not waivable. If you could talk about how that Concom review interplays with the Board of Appeals review.
So the Conservation Commission, the Board of Health, the Planning Board, every other municipal board in town, including the Board of Selectmen, have a role in comprehensive permit reviews by submitting comments to the Board of Appeals during the application process. So the developer files for a comprehensive permit. The Board of Appeals notifies all local boards of the application, and those boards can submit comments as to their particular areas of expertise. And that can be individuals, for example, the building commissioner, the fire chief, the police chief, and so on. the Conservation Commission has separate jurisdiction when the Wetlands Protection Act is triggered. So depending on the facts, if the project has impacts to or proximity to a wetland resource or endangered species habitat or a locally identified resource in a local bylaw, then the Conservation Commission has jurisdiction under the Wetlands Protection Act or the local wetlands bylaw. And that is a separate jurisdiction from the Board of Appeals. Now, the Board of Appeals can waive local wetlands regulations, but it cannot waive the Wetlands Protection Act. So if a project site has 5 vernal pools and a quarter-mile of bordering vegetated wetland, and the project is going to impact those resources, the applicant has to file with the Concom as if it were a regular project outside of 40B. And that takes a natural path through the Conservation Commission or on appeal to DEP or on appeal from DEP to an adjudicatory hearing. That is totally independent from what the Board of Appeals is doing. However, the Board of Appeals is watching what's taking place there because that could affect the location or the density of a particular project. So it's relevant, but it is a totally separate process. Angus, does the Concom have a local wetland bylaw?
No.
Okay, so, it's going to be then just under the State Act. So the Conservation Commission is going to review a project that's triggered under the Wetlands Protection Act, and that's going to take a natural path. And the Board of Appeals will not be asked to grant any waivers from the local bylaw because there is no local bylaw.
So does this particular project fall under wetlands or not?
Yes, it does. And I'll jump in because John's scope is not specific to this project. But yes, this site has wetlands. It is subject to the Concom review, and the wetland delineations have not been determined yet. The Conservation Commission, as people, especially direct abutters, would know, there was a filing earlier this year. There was a public hearing notice that went out that set a date for that to open. That did not open on that date because of the COVID-19. And so that is kind of indefinitely tabled. The Conservation Commission is holding off on scheduling that and scheduling a site walk and so forth. They want to see what happens with the public health emergency. But that would simply be the resource area delineation. Subsequent to that would be a filing for order of conditions. Sorry, my lights went.
Thank you, Angus.
So yes, it's subject to the Concom jurisdiction.
Thank you.
There was John, if you can just reiterate the discussion about the large project safe harbor.
So the large project safe harbor is an ability for a town to deny a comprehensive permit project or approve it with conditions with no appeal to the Housing Appeals Committee, depending on the size of the town. So the municipalities with fewer than 25 housing units, or municipalities between 2,500 and 5,000 housing units, or 5,000 and 7,500 units, all have different large project categories. So West Newbury, Angus, has how many housing units currently?
It's about, I believe it's about 1,700.
So then if it's below 2,500 housing units,
It definitely is.
Yes.
Yep.
Then if the comprehensive permit application involves construction of housing units equal to 6% of the housing units in West Newbury, then that would be consistent with local needs. So you take the number of how many housing units you have times 6%, and that would be the definition of large project in West Newbury.
A question came in about whether the Conservation Commission order of conditions counts in the uneconomic assessment.
No, great question. No, the uneconomic analysis is going to be what the Board of Appeals does to the project. Now, an applicant in their pro forma will have as a line item permitting costs, and they will build into that line item of permitting costs what it's going to cost to go through the Concom. But an applicant that files a project with the Board of Appeals before the Board of Appeals touches it cannot claim the project is uneconomic. In other words, if on day one I file an application with the Board of Appeals and on day 180 the Board of Appeals doesn't impose any conditions or doesn't require any reduction in density, the applicant does not have an uneconomic argument. So the order of conditions, to answer the question directly, Angus, no, because that is not the fault of the Board of Appeals. Uneconomic is a condition that the Board of Appeals caused. And the Board of Appeals clearly didn't cause the requirement of a order of conditions filing or a MIPA filing or any of the other required filings. So no, great question.
So Archie, I want to get your blessing as the chair. My thought would be to unmute everybody, and just like we did when the April 9th meeting, just look to everybody to try to not speak all at once. Or should I go through like one at a time? We have about 46 people on the call. And Archie, you're muted, so I can't hear what you're saying.
Right. Why don't you, is there a way to like unmute like a row or something like that?
Yeah,
so
why don't I'll unmute a few at a time, and and they can speak if they wish, and if not, we'll just keep going down the list. So, and some people are showing up as muted, but that's because they have muted themselves. So right now, so that would be, for instance, AS, Ann O'Sullivan, Brian O'Hara. You are all muted, but I have not muted you. So if you unmute yourselves, and if you have any comment, you could do so. Caller 5, caller 10 is now unmuted. Cheryl Brown is now unmuted.
Oh my God, it's so weird.
Deb Binder, you're muted, but it looks like you've muted yourself. Deborah Caminiti.
I have a question. If we cannot reduce the density of the project, can we increase the percentage of affordable housing?
That's a great question. No. And first of all, you can reduce the density if the reduction doesn't render the project uneconomic. But one of the takeaways from the Attitash case that I was referring to earlier, one of the ironies of that case, and one of the reasons I found it so disturbing, was that the ability of a board to require 30% of the housing units to be set aside at below market was disallowed. The Supreme Judicial Court said that that's a programmatic requirement and only Mass Housing would have jurisdiction to do that. So when faced with whether we really are talking about developing additional affordable housing, the court ruled against us. And that was a very disappointing part of that case, among others. So no, if the applicant comes in at 25% below market, because that's what their project eligibility letter says, then the board cannot seek or cannot require it to be greater. The board could negotiate with the applicant and say, you know what, we have a particular need here for elderly housing or for handicap housing or whatever it may be. We want this, would you provide that? If the applicant assents, that's one thing, but the board cannot require a change to the programmatic approvals of Mass Housing. It's a great question.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Don Doak and Elisa Grammer, it looks like you've got yourselves on mute, but if either of you have comments, you're not muted on this end. Same for Kathy Fieri as well.
Don Doak at 14 Cortland Lane. Want to thank the Board of Selectmen, you, Angus, and John for putting this together. Extremely helpful, extremely informative. John, it's just great to go through these things and understand the X's and the O's of it. One of the things I just want to confirm that I heard is that the ZBA, through kind of the 53 that you referenced, will have an opportunity to review the pro forma, because pro forma will go to max and min profitability of a project based on what could be in their valuations of property, so forth and so on. So it sounds like that pro forma review, although I understand that it's not, you know, a given, it's not simple to do, but it is important. John, is that correct?
It is, and it's going to provide the Board of Appeals with guidance, and it's a snapshot in time. The applicant is going to correctly say it's a pro forma that I developed on Friday. It might change a week from today. That will be correct, but the Board of Appeals has to render a decision, and that's a snapshot in time. So the Board of Appeals needs to have the information to know whether it can require things, a better design or better buffering or more landscaping without rendering the project uneconomic. So you can't do that without a pro forma. The regs themselves make it clear that the board is not to engage in this debate early on, and I advise the board to follow the regs, of course, but the regs do not prohibit the requirement of a pro forma, nor, to your comment, sir, is the Board of Appeals precluded from sending the pro forma out to a third-party reviewer. So one of your 53G experts typically should be, or would generally be, a CPA or a CFA, someone who can analyze numbers and give the Board of Appeals some support. And that's not suggesting the Board of Appeals doesn't have that skill set. I'm just saying you get a third-party objective review of that information.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Angus, and board for holding this. Appreciate it.
I have a question. Could you tell me if once the ZBA has the pro forma, does that become public record so it could be reviewed?
Yes, yeah.
Citizens?
Everything the ZBA receives in this matter or any 40B matter is a public record, yes.
John, would that pro forma be any different than the pro forma that was included in the application that's already been sent to the town?
So great question. So many times it is, and that's my snapshot in time comment. So we've often seen a developer will file a pro forma with Mass Housing and then file a different pro forma with the Board of Appeals. And that's not untoward, it's just the numbers have changed. So the application to Mass Housing will not necessarily be the same pro forma the ZBA will receive when it requires the submission of the same.
I have a question. Can the developer move affordable housing out of his development into other houses around town?
Not under 40B. So there are, and Angus knows this well, there are planning techniques that we've developed across the country that allow for that, both through inclusionary zoning and transfer of development rights. But no, the 40B process does not allow for development off-site, so to speak. So if I have a 5-acre parcel and I'm the 40B applicant, my housing units are built on that 5-acre parcel, not split with other parcels across town. The only way to do that, Mr. Kelly, might be I'd have multiple parcels. Both would have to require or obtain a project eligibility letter. Both would be submitted to the Board of Appeals. That I've never seen happen. It could, but so to answer your question is no, they're built all on site.
Thank you.
Excuse me, I have a question. This is Brendan Murphy on Maple Street. I'm just curious to know if will this proposal in its scope, are there enough units and affordable units planned so that it would protect the town against, it would get us into that safe harbor area to protect against future proposals like this? Or is there a concern that, 2 years from now or 5 years from now, whatever it is, we're in the same exact position?
John, I can speak to that. So the answer is that this proposal, if it went forward in its current form, would not produce enough affordable units to get the town to the 10%. However, if the timing and sequencing of the development aligned with the town's housing production plan, which is to say that 8 affordable units would be produced each year, for every year that those 8 units are built and certified as being compliant by the state, that would produce 1 year of safe harbor from other 40B proposals. And similar to that, if 16 units were built in a single year, that would produce 2 years of safe harbor. When that 1 year or 2 years has passed, that safe harbor would lapse. But I would say whether on this, Coffin Street site or not, whether this proposal or not, 40B is definitely a statute the town needs to be aware of, and it's something we're going to be dealing with.
Great, thank you.
I have a question. So when the zoning board of appeals gets the pro forma, it's useful for helping determine when the project becomes uneconomical. Can the pro forma be challenged, meaning that maybe it was not a very accurate one, or does that have to be taken as fact by the ZBA?
No, it can definitely be challenged, and that's the benefit of having outside consultants, where just like a outside consultant might challenge the developer's stormwater analysis, the board's consultant might challenge the developer's pro forma. Oh no, because of the importance of the pro forma is the be all and end all in terms of knowing how many conditions and what type of conditions the board can impose. You really need to know that it's valid and properly done and defensible. So no, every aspect of the application is subject to scrutiny, by the Board of Appeals and its consultants, and the pro forma is certainly one of those documents.
I have a question. There's a limit on the number. There's not really a limit on the number of consultants, but there is, in a sense, you were saying. So can additional funds come from other sources, either private or town funds, if we want to hire additional consultants?
So the town, the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Appeals, with the whatever fiscal authority they have, they certainly can hire their own consultants. My opinion, for what it's worth, is take advantage of 53G so that you're not spending public funds to do that. But you certainly could. That's certainly none of my business. In terms of can the private sector contribute money for the review, every municipality is different. As a general rule, those kind of contributions go into the general fund and not for a specific project. So I would defer to town council on that. I don't want to opine on that. But the more important part, I think, is the original part of your question, which is, can the municipality hire its own consultants outside of 53G? And the answer is yes, of course it can.
Thank you.
Angus, have you unmuted people further down the line?
I've been cycling through, so there's many people who are unmuted at this point.
John, you had asked if the town of West Newbury had their own wetland, I forget the term you used, but it sounded like our own plan for the wetland. And then Angus responded that we don't, so that you had said that we have to use the state's plan. Is there any advantage for us to put together a West Newbury wetland plan? Like, should we be considering that?
So it would be a local wetlands bylaw, and the Conservation Commission would go to town meeting, and town meeting would approve a local bylaw, and then the Conservation Commission could develop local wetland regulations. And, you know, I'll defer to Angus and the Board of Selectmen and the Concom for whether that's advisable or not. But if you had a local wetland bylaw, then that would be part of what the Board of Appeals could require compliance with. The applicant could ask for waivers from it, but the Board of Appeals would be able to determine whether or not to grant those waivers. The local wetlands bylaw can be more restrictive than the state act. And where the city or town has a local ordinance or bylaw, it works in tandem and sometimes independently from the state act. Most local wetlands bylaws are much more restrictive than the Wetlands Protection Act, much more protective of the wetland resource. And I don't remember the exact number of cities and towns in the Commonwealth, but it's a very large number of cities and towns that have a local bylaw. And in West Newbury's case, you'd go to town meeting to pursue that.
And how difficult is that to do? Is that something fairly, like it's a vote, or is it a long?
So there would be a proposal to be an article on your town meeting warrant to see if the town will vote to accept the following local wetlands bylaw pursuant to, and, you know, it would spell it out. If town meeting approves it and the Attorney General subsequently approves it, which presumably they would, then the Concom would be able to promulgate regulations. And there are some very detailed local bylaws out there, some very simple ones and some very complicated ones. No, you know, it's the same process as getting a zoning bylaw adopted or revised. The town meeting action, and then it defaults to the Concom.
So Angus, do we not have a wetlands bylaw now?
That's correct.
Are you in favor of getting one?
I don't know. I don't see that we have any members of the Conservation Commission. Correct me if I'm wrong if you're out there, but I don't see that we have any Concom members. And as a fairly new person to town, I would be very reluctant to respond to that, because I'm going to show some deference to that commission that they've done or not done what they feel is in the best interest of the town. I think that's a very legitimate question that you've asked, but I think the commission should be the initial party to respond to that, in my view. I don't know if others, as particularly Archie or Rick, have any further comment on that.
So that's fair enough. In the absence of that, would the EPA at the state level have to approve this project?
No, just to be clear, our commission has a very, by what I've heard and my observation, a very rigorous local permitting process. But the standards that apply are the standards that are the State Wetlands Protection Act, not additional standards through local regulations. So the Concom is still the permit granting authority for any impact or actually any development on any property with any resource area, whether that's a wetland or a vernal pool or the State Rivers Protection Act.
Yeah, my understanding is our Concom enforces or uses the State Wetlands Protection Act very aggressively. But as far as I know, we do not have any of our own wetlands bylaws.
Thank you.
Angus.
Thank you.
Are there other questions or comments?
I would love to speak if you have the time.
Go ahead, whomever.
My name is Kelly Scott. I live at 36 Coffin Street. I'm in a butter. And I moved here when I was 10 years old. We bought the land from Ed Boucher. We have had the ability to use his land to graze our horses and walk since I was 10 years old. The stream that runs by my house, where there will now be a road, drains directly into the Indian River. The stream on the other side of my property, where there will be 16 houses, drains directly into the Merrimack River. There's a well where we used to go and fill jugs of water because the water was so pristine. There are incredible amounts of wetlands. There's an incredible amount of wildlife out there. It is incredibly connective to the Greenbelt areas, from Bridge Street all the way to River Bend and all the Essex County Greenbelt areas. This is land that we should be preserving, and it is clearly important in terms of wildlife, not to mention the Native American artifacts we've found. You want to look up the Coffin Street assemblage. There's a museum in Liberty, Maine that we have artifacts there. I don't know how to fight this. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a teacher. I'm a landowner. I'm a taxpayer. I don't know how to fight someone who wants to put 152 houses where I have watched deer and herons my entire life. But I would love to know how I can help. I'm not against lower income housing. God knows West Newbury is well overvalued compared to the state average. And no elderly that I know could afford to keep their homes here. I would love to have a town plan, a comprehensive town plan for housing. But I know that Ed Boucher, in all his orderliness, was only ever approved for 6 housing lots. I wasn't on the ladder. I know that because of the perk testing that I watched him do. This proposal, it takes advantage of every loophole, and I took copious notes. I have 16 pages of notes. Oh my God, thank you, John Whitten. Thank you, Board of Selectmen, for putting this together. I have a master's degree, and I'm trying to follow what to do next. But this is not okay. We're supposed to be a green community. We're supposed to be preserving our land. We're supposed to be connecting Essex Greenbelt. There are plenty of other parcels or ways to develop this parcel that don't include 152 units, 200 and some odd cars on Coffin Street. Come down Coffin Street, which, by the way, they're not even using the access road that's already there. They're going to put a new road right next to the stream. Right next to the stream. They're going to put a new road. I'm asking. I've lived here since I was 10. I've had privileges to use his land until he died, and then from his son. We've grazed our horses on his land and used it as our own. Ask any police officer who's ever hunted Ed Boucher's land. He has never been more generous. But yeah, you are going to see a cutoff in what should be open space if we are truly a green conservation community. And okay, you tell me what to do. You tell me how. I'm in the butter, so I guess I got some appeals ways. I took 16 pages of notes tonight, but this Board of Selectmen are walking this tomorrow. How about walking it with someone who's known it since they were 10 years old? How about walking it with someone who knows the land and knows that this is not accurate? How about walking it with someone who knows where the wetlands truly are, the vernal pools that won't be there, because that's what a vernal pool is. How about walking it with someone who knows where the horse graveyard is? I'm here, Board of Selectmen, I'm here. And
Well,
thank
we haven't been given permission by the controller of the land to include anybody else. Partly.
Why would they include me? Why would he help me to show you what this land is really like?
Well, I mean, the person, we can't go on private property unless someone gives their permission.
I have not been given any notice that I no longer have permission to use an entirety of the land that I have had permission written since I was 10 from his son John once he died. No one has told me I no longer have permission to walk or use his land as I have for literally 2 decades.
I do have a couple of comments, Archie, if I could.
Okay.
I do want to just reiterate that we are really very early in the process here with the mass housing project eligibility letter. There is not anything yet filed before the board. One of the biggest values to a town of the project eligibility process is to identify the issues that need to be drilled down on in more detail, much more detail in the permitting stage. So all of the comments, well over 100 sets of comments at this point that we've received, is all very helpful in helping the board and the various town departments and boards and commissions make sure that we all know what the issues are, so that when the time comes, if something is filed locally, that we can move very quickly to get the third-party reviews that we'll need to really drill down on all of these issues, whether that's civil engineering, wetlands, stormwater, species habitat, traffic, pedestrian safety, fiscal impact, pro forma review. So that's really a big value of this process. And I can tell you from my own experience, and John knows this because he himself was in a butter to a proposed 40B, that back in the early 2000s, there was no project eligibility letter. And so there were times that a 40B would be filed with the town with no advance notice, and that clock was ticking. So I think, what we're doing, we did request and receive from Mass Housing an extension from the typical 30-day comment period to a 75-day comment period. And, we've gotten the word out broadly, and the neighbors and others have been very helpful in getting the word out even more broadly. And so that's generated lots and lots of comments, all of which have been provided to the board and will continue to do so. So I'll just emphasize, we hear everything that you're saying. We hear everything that everybody is saying. We've got all of this on record. And so that's going to help the boards and the staff do the best that we possibly can on behalf of the town within what I think we all understand, and John has articulated very well, is a challenging framework for a town that is accustomed to enforcing its rules and making sure things are built to the standards that are set out in the town bylaws. That's not the way 40B works. But with that said, the town is not without, there's ways that we can approach this, and we're trying to do the best we can for the town. So I should probably keep it general at this point.
I'd also like to reiterate that I read through practically all the comments last couple of days, and really valuable. Anybody that hasn't contributed, sending an email to the Board of Selectmen or to Angus, or not an email, just written, whatever. They're not being ignored. They're being looked at. Everyone's ideas, some are redundant, but some are not. Everyone can contribute to this process. We're going to create a summary document, but we're also going to have the individual letters themselves presented to Mass Housing. So anyone that hasn't sent in, I would recommend them. There's still time to do so. Please do so. Give us more ideas.
Hi, Angus. Question for you. Would you be in favor of pushing forward with wetlands bylaws for the town of West Newbury?
It's really not my purview to say. The way I view my role as town manager is, largely as a facilitator. Well, at least in this capacity, I would obviously look to the commission as the jurisdictional entity. I think if a wetlands bylaw was to be brought forward, I think it ought to be initiated by the commission, since they would be the enforcing authority. Their staff person would be carrying out that bylaw. It's a very good question that I think, people are fully, you ought to ask that of the commission, and perhaps the selectmen might ask that of the commission, because certainly the selectmen also actually have just as much standing as anybody to bring forward a bylaw if they saw fit. So I will say, without commentary, I will say I was very surprised when I started working here in the town that we do not have a local wetlands bylaw, because in the other towns I've worked in, that has definitely been part of the regulatory framework.
Thank you for being candid. I appreciate it.
John, I would ask you, would doing something like that be changing the goalposts in the middle of the game, and would that be subject to something that in the appeals process would be thrown out? Well, you're changing the wetlands rules too late, and that's my question.
It's a fair question. No, it wouldn't be thrown out. If you always start somewhere. So if you had a town meeting coming up soon, and I'm assuming you do, and you had a bylaw that was on the warrant, and that was adopted prior to the application of a comprehensive permit coming in, then the bylaw would be effective. If the application beat the bylaw's adoption, then the application would be immune from the bylaw. So no, I think the question, Archie, really is it bad faith for a municipality to adopt a bylaw anticipating an application coming down the pike? And the answer is no. You adopt bylaws because of changing circumstances. And if the town wanted to move forward with a change to your local Board of Health regulations because you were worried that you weren't protected enough, that would not be bad faith. So no, you proceed, it's business as usual. If town meeting were supportive of it, and it was adopted before an application came in, then that bylaw would be effective.
Was it Angus? John, just to make you aware, we do have a local wetlands bylaw, section 25, Roman numeral 25 of the town bylaws, but it basically just incorporates the Wetlands Protection Act as our bylaws and the regulations pursuant thereto. So in our bylaws, we do have the, a wetlands protection bylaw. And you can look up on the town clerk's website and under town bylaws and see what it is. Page 38.
Yeah, and Mike, I defer to you. It may be that you could use that to be the basis for regulations if you felt that that was encompassing enough. If, you know, town meeting's already granted the Concom that authority, and it may be that the piece missing or is the regulatory piece. And, you know, again, I defer to you on that, but you may already be there. It just is missing the regulatory support for the bylaw.
I'll take a look at that. But the way the bylaw seems to be structured, it seems to follow the wetlands bylaw and the regulations promulgated pursuant to the wetlands.
Yeah, I can follow up with you and Angus, you know, the next day and talk about that. I mean, maybe there's an easier way out of this than you know, using Section 25 to build on the regulatory piece.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
I'd like to,
Angus, I have a question if there's time.
If I might, I do want to return to, there was one point that Kelly Scott raised that I wanted to respond to that I had forgot to initially, but she had said something about that the prior landowner had gotten 6 units approved, and as people probably have seen within the application to mass housing, there's something presented as a so-called as-of-right plan. That's a really important piece of that submittal because it's what the applicant has represented to mass housing is the underlying development scenario that could be permitted under the local regulations. And I just want to make people aware, the town is not going to accept that plan as fact. That's something that the Planning Board, the Conservation Commission, the Board of Health, and others will be looking at that closely to see whether they, in fact, share that assessment that so-called as-of-right plan could be built under the existing regulations.
I think we should. First of all, I want to thank John. It's a fantastic job. You really helped everybody out here amazingly. So thank you very much. Let's have 1 or 2 more questions, and I think then we'll call it a night.
We have Deb Binder, I believe, has a question. Deb.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I understand that first of all, great presentation, by the way, and thanks for pulling this together. And I have a question about how the citizens can participate in this, because I know the town, the people who work for the town have certain limitations, for lack of a better word. And certainly there's a lot of community interest. So is there a group out there that is pulling together to be a voice in addition to all the letters and emails and individual petitions that are going around? What is the best way for the citizens to work with the town? Because let's face it, sometimes the citizens have a different way of communicating or can do things that the town maybe can't do or say.
Well, you know, I can offer this. The Board of Appeals process, it's a public hearing to gather evidence and then compile that evidence, which will be the basis for a decision. So the role of the public in a public hearing is to provide the Board of Appeals with evidence and facts and opinion that the board can then use as a basis in part for its decision. So the Board of Appeals are the fact finders, and the board hires experts, and the board listens to the public. So, you know, my experience, not speaking about any particular application, having been on the Board of Selectmen and having worked with a lot of boards of appeals, is if the board is given factual information of relevance, then the board's really going to, it's going to absorb it. It's going to take it all in, as opposed to emotion and as opposed to kind of hyperbole about the applicant, for example. So typically an applicant comes in with a bit of bravado, and an applicant will bring in a team of experts, and it becomes an attack against those experts and the applicant. And I've often found that is very off-putting to a lot of boards. The boards are looking for evidence, and the more that the public, and Ms. Scott's comments rather, provide evidence, about the history of the site, especially if it's archaeological and it's Native American sites or endangered species habitats. So that's the kind of stuff that an adjudicatory body like the Board of Appeals wants to hear. And that would be my advice. Stick to the facts, stick to the things that are relevant, and then the board can absorb that as part of its fact finding, because that's what their job is that's what they're supposed to do.
So how do the people such as that woman who was so eloquent know who to talk to or when to share that type of information? And how do the abutters know that they should or could file the, whatever it's called, the abutters thing? Like, how does that word get out to those people so they can voice in a constructive manner?
Well, West Newbury is a small town, so you have that advantage, but there will be a formal public notice when an application is made for any comprehensive permit. There'll be a butter notification to property owners within 300 feet of the subject site. And then there's, word of mouth. The public hearing is a public hearing, and it's totally up to the Board of Appeals as to how the board's chair runs their meetings. Some boards allow public comment every session. Some boards let the applicant go first and ask the public to wait until the second or third hearing. Totally up to the Board of Appeals. There's no wrong answer there. But the public hearing is to hear from the public, not just the applicant. And applicants often hijack public hearings by bringing in 5 or 6 consultants, and they speak for days upon days, and then the public gets exhausted and starts to not show up anymore. That's part of this process, and the public has the right to be heard, both orally during the hearing, but also to submit written testimony. So you have the advantage of being in a small town, and small towns have a lot of advantages, and this is one of them. I can't imagine that everybody in West Newbury isn't going to be aware of when an application is made to the Board of Appeals.
Gotcha. Thank you very
much. Angus or Archie, may I also address that, since Deb was asking about any neighborhood or community group?
Yes, go ahead, Don.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, Deb. My name is Don Doak. I had shared earlier. I'm on 14 Cortlandt Lane, a direct abutter. And we have established the West Newbury Neighborhood Coalition of abutters, but way beyond abutters, well over 100 people, and would be happy to talk with you. And to John's point, we are trying to look at facts. You have to flush through many things to get there, but we would welcome anyone's participation in that. So you can contact me either through the Facebook West Newbury page, I'm on that, or certainly even just to contact me at my home at 14 Cortlandt Lane.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering what the site walk for tomorrow is about. If it's not about wetlands and abutters' knowledge of the land, and like, what's the purpose of the Board of Selectmen walking just themselves?
If I could speak to that briefly, Archie, and you and Rick can certainly supplement. But the board wants to get some on the ground introduction to the land. It will admittedly be limited. It is not in any way the only site walk that will take place. There will be a second one, at least one more later this month, with other staff, members of the CBA. But as Archie said a couple of minutes ago, this is private property. The developer does have site control, and so he does get to limit if he doesn't want to allow public access. And given the public health situation right now, he's very much got that on his side. And we have been very careful to make sure that the total attendance for tomorrow will not exceed 10 under the governor's order. That's just the condition of the world right now. But I also want to make it really, really clear, this is an important point, the Conservation Commission permitting process is totally separate and distinct from any Board of Appeals process, and it's also totally separate and distinct from this current mass housing seeking of comments, which again is not a regulatory process. There is no permit currently pending before the town of West Newbury. We're simply in a commenting posture toward mass housing. So I know with great certainty the Conservation Commission will do its own very thorough site walk where they're looking at the resource area delineation, any wetlands, any other protected resource areas like vernal pools. So, you know, tomorrow is not in any way the end all be all. And while the board did early on, you know, 2 or 3 weeks ago, make a statement in public meeting that there would be public access provided. Yes, and that would be their objective. There is no question about that. But you know, we don't control the site. Private entity controls the site and is fully within their rights to place that limitation, and does have public health justification on his side to do so. With that said, I do also want to say we're going to record the site walk. I don't know how compelling the viewing will be, but we will record it. We don't want anybody to think there's any, you know, offline deliberation or anything like that. It'll be.
Well, please walk right up next to the street where the new road's gonna go. Please walk right up where the new road's going to go. Please.
So Angus, question, are you saying you would not proceed without CONSCOM vetting and approval?
If the question is whether the Board of Appeals would proceed without CONCOM, I guess, John, I would look to you to comment on how those interplay in terms of timing. In my experience over the years as town planner, I've seen sometimes applications run in parallel where they're simultaneously before both the Board of Appeals and the Conservation Commission. I don't believe that's required. I've seen other instances where one board issues a permit contingent upon approval of the other board or commission, so they could proceed in sequence. I do believe that is the applicant's right to seek the permits in the sequence that they want. If I was a developer, I would think, you know, you'd be wise to, at a minimum, get that resource area delineation done early. And I do know they filed for that early this year. And I do know that the developers, eager for the commission to go forward with the resource area delineation. The commission has not yet done so, and they have the basis of the governor's order, which tolls the timelines that would normally apply. But it's definitely in the developer's interest to pin down what those resource areas are, because they are subject to the required offsets or setbacks.
Yeah, I totally agree. It makes no sense for a developer to seek Board of Appeals approval for a project that's going to be thrown a kind of a kilter by the CONCOM. So you would always try to determine areas that can't be built upon or can't be infringed upon, and that, in this case, or in most cases, would be the wetlands resource. So yeah, you'd get the resource determination done first, and then a savvy developer would also seek further approvals from the CONCOM. But as Angus said, there's no requirement. I have seen developers go to the Board of Appeals first, even though the CONCOM has not weighed in, and then the whole project gets revised later. It's crazy, but it has happened. There is no sequencing requirement under Chapter 40B, as crazy as that sounds.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank everybody. I think it's getting late. Thank Don especially. Thank everyone for listening. Again, please send more comments to into the town. This is
I'm sorry, Archie. We do have Archie. There's one person, Scott Blazinski, who I don't believe has commented yet, and he sent me a text.
Oh, okay.
So if, but maybe perhaps it could be the last comment.
Archie and Angus, can you guys hear me all right?
We can.
Thanks for allowing me to ask a question. I wanted to thank you, Angus, and the Board of Selectmen for this forum. John, I truly appreciate this whole session, because what is an absolute crazy 40B legislation, you've at least helped me make sense of some part of it. So I appreciate that. I also would like to thank Kim Scott, encourage her to join the West Newbury Neighborhood Coalition, because your impassioned statements, probably one of the reasons why me and my wife moved to this community. So thank you. My question, John, is this. Kelly mentioned Indian artifacts. In your experience, has that been something to unravel a 40B?
So just parenthetically, for 20 some odd years, I've taught a course on American Indian law, first at the Boston College Law School and now at Tufts, where I've been for a long time. The answer is yes, because federal law, of course, supersedes state law, and state law supersedes local law. So if in fact it is either endangered species habitat or Native American archaeological site or a historic site, then that is something that would trump the comprehensive permit statute. If it in fact is a recognized burial site or historic site otherwise, then that is facts that the Board of Appeals really wants to know.
Excellent. Thank you for that clarification and confirmation. My last question, John, is it sounds like through your workshop and through this discussion, most 40Bs are stopped or sidetracked through primarily environmental issues. Is that accurate?
So the history of 40Bs that never get built are typically economic. The market tanks and the developer gives up. That's typically the case where the developer does not own the property, where the development is under purchase and sale agreement, the purchase and sale agreement expires, and then the developer walks away. Where the developer owns the property, they have a lot more staying power typically and can hang in there through economic cycles. So yeah, it's typically environmental resources, or the market has changed such that that type of housing is no longer warranted. So it went from sale to rental, and now rental is the big thing, not sale. But yes, because the real reason that your question is so important is it speaks to the issues that the Board of Appeals cannot adjudicate. Title V, the Wetlands Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act, or any federal law are the same issues that the Housing Appeals Committee cannot adjudicate. So if they can't adjudicate them, then the project can't move forward. So long-winded answer to your question, which is yes, environmental resources or other historic resources or archaeological resources are things that are beyond the scope of the Housing Appeals Committee, beyond the scope of the Board of Appeals. Those are typically project stoppers.
Got it. Thank you.
Sorry,
Okay,
but that was a good closing comment, I think.
Yes. So thank you, everybody. This is only the beginning of something that may go a long time or may go a short time. We don't know, but we are listening to everybody, and we're all going to work on this together. Thank you very much, and thank you, John. Very amazing presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a great presentation, John. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the expertise.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Angus.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, John.
Good night.
Night.
Thank you.